In the United States, we are mostly concerned with regulating death and financial loss. That's the stuff that we're pretty good at protecting Americans against. But there have been times in our history where when technology has begun to mess with how Americans relate to one another, that the political class does sometimes snap awake. And this week, we've started to see that happen around AI. We're going to get deep into that later, but first I want to run you through some of the headlines. The top headline today, of course, was Nvidia. Nvidia announced its earnings and reported that it's going to make, in the third quarter, or in the last quarter, Q3, it made, I believe, $51.2 billion, which is about 3% more than analysts were expecting. And this is, if you don't invest in Nvidia, you think you don't care about this. But the reason you care about this is that Nvidia is a huge part of the economy at the moment. Not necessarily directly. It is the biggest company in the history of companies. It's worth $4.5 trillion. But what it does, is sort of like, it's like the caffeine in the coffee that everybody drinks. It's kind of moving everything forward. And it's affecting pension funds. It's affecting non-residential real estate investment. It's affecting all these corners of the economy. And so, that revenue growth that it is projecting helped relieve investors' fears that the AI bubble was kind of over. So everyone gets to sort of breathe a sigh of relief. The stock was up a couple of percentage points in after-hours trading. Good news for Nvidia, all told. The thing to understand is that the story's not necessarily over, that we still are seeing incredibly circular investment, for instance, in that industry. Right now, Nvidia has put about $10 billion into one customer, that's Anthropic. So literally, they get paid by Anthropic for their chips, but they're putting some of that money back into the company. They've invested $100 billion in OpenAI and made investments in either kind or in money in Amazon and Google, such that this is really, it's starting to feel like, summer camp where you all sit on each other's laps and see how long you can make that circle hold. When somebody gets tired, that thing falls apart. And so the worry here, of course, is that this can't last forever, and that short of, building data centers in space like they say we will someday do, there's going to be at some point a popping of this bubble. But at least for the moment, that has not turned out to be the case. AI bubble fears, however, are still topping the list among institutional investors. Fund managers are really focused on this. They say AI overvaluation is the single biggest tail risk in markets. It's above geopolitics, it's above inflation. It's the thing they are worried about. So everyone's going to keep watching out for that. In other tech news, Google is pushing Gemini 3 deeper into search and workspace. Early reactions suggest that the company is really trying to just kind of regain narrative control in generative AI after a pretty rough year of product stumbles. Also worth noting here that Sundar Pichai, head of Alphabet, basically said that even Google is not insulated against the AI bubble if it does pop, which leads investors to continue to be a little bit worried about that. Yesterday, Cloudflare had a big outage, about 3 hours, in which that provider of back-end services to all these different sites, Spotify, OpenAI, ChatGPT, Grok, and X, they really had a huge misfire. And basically a system that protects websites against bots, including the kinds of data scraping bots that feed into AI systems. Their system for dealing with those bots broke down, kind of wrote a wrong file essentially, and crashed itself. It's just a reminder that there's sort of the cascading failures they saw in their bot mitigation systems really are a reminder that AI's smart future here depends on plumbing, and sometimes that plumbing really breaks down. Meanwhile, the EU, which has been all about regulation, getting out in front of regulation more so than any other Western democracy, is supposedly going to delay enforcement of its high-risk AI rules until 2027. Supposedly this is due to lobbying pressure from big tech. The EU has really been the leader in trying to identify risk early and trying to regulate it early, compared to the United States, where there is no regulation whatsoever. That's really been one of the only places where it's happening. And the fact that they are slowing that down suggests that they are feeling some of the pressure to be part of the AI boom. In other regulatory news, state law has been really the only form of regulation around AI so far. And back when the big, beautiful bill was being considered, a provision got snuck into it that was essentially going to create a 10-year moratorium on state AI law. No state would be allowed to regulate AI at all, according to this provision. That provision got defeated 99-1. Nobody wanted that. Even some of the staunchest supporters of President Trump in the Senate said, no, thank you. Well, now Trump is pushing it again. There's this push underway to freeze state-level AI laws yet again and to prevent the kind of patchwork of regulations that these companies clearly don't want. But considering that California, Illinois, these are states that are truly pushing the only form of regulation on AI that affects your day-to-day life, it's kind of concerning to imagine that the federal government might just wipe that away, considering that there are literally no federal regulations around this stuff at all. There isn't even a data privacy regulation in the United States. And a $100 billion AI infrastructure fund launched this week, and that is attracting sovereign wealth interest. You may have caught the news that Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia visited with President Trump in the White House. He got the red carpet treatment. There was a tough exchange with an ABC reporter who asked Mohammed bin Salman about the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, pointing out that who was a journalist killed in working in the United States, who was killed by Saudi forces, according to American intelligence officials. Well, she asked him, about that, and President Trump came to his defense in front of these reporters, said, you shouldn't ask that question, what a nasty question, that kind of response. And it had me wondering, well, what is it that we're getting from the Saudis that we would be willing to excuse this kind of thing? And whether this was actually Trump's thinking or not, it's clear that, a several $100 billion investment in AI infrastructure may very well be what it costs to get out of accountability for having murdered a journalist, an American journalist. So the underlying theme here for me is, with all of these, focusing here on all of this infrastructure concern. Do we have enough chips? Can Nvidia meet the demand? Is their valuation, connected to real fundamentals in the company? All of these questions of regulation and the rest of it, there's a real tension emerging here between AI acceleration, which everyone seems so fired up about, and the real physical and political restraints that seem to be starting to play out in this world a little bit. There's something powerful happening there in that tension. So let's think a little bit now about something bigger. I want to think about, go a little bit deeper on something that Bernie Sanders had to say recently about the power of AI and how it might really transform the job market, but also he said something, really, really powerful about how human beings are changing. Basically, he basically said that he just thought that we need to start thinking about a technology that's going to conceivably wipe out a huge number of jobs in the United States. But he also talked about, the possibility that this system is going to isolate people, is going to make them more mentally ill, is going to in some way, create real an interruption to the social fabric. And it got me thinking about all the times in the past when that has been true. So we've seen this, we've seen sort of real-time panic around new media technologies forever, right? I mean, in the 1840s, when the telegraph was first debuted, there was a true recognition that they could really, accelerate the sort of the pace of business, maybe hurt judgment in that way, get rid of sort of, the kind of deliberative process that came with waiting for a letter to arrive, and might, in this case, state legislators and newspaper editors sometimes argued that the telegraph would excite passions and disturb public reason. And that was really the first time that U.S. leaders asked, if communication accelerates too fast, does it harm democracy in some way? We saw that again with movies in the 1900s, the idea that movies and cinema would somehow corrupt the youth, the loss of innocence, that it would teach kids to imitate adult behaviors. And that was basically states passed movie censorship laws. We started to see a reaction to this. And as I run through these, you may find yourself thinking, well, that's stupid. I understand. But just think through a little bit what it was for politicians to think this stuff through. They were thinking about, there may need to be some sort of code here to deal with this new technology, because this new technology may change cognition and social behavior. This is the same stuff we're starting to worry about with AI right now. In the 1930s, the Federal Communications Commission was born after, regulators began to realize that radio was really creating the potential for mass propaganda, for emotional humiliation, for demagogues. You had Father Coughlin, who was one of the great public figures of that time, really, running a kind of cult-like influence over a lot of people at that time. So that was the first time we really saw national-scale misinformation. And as a result, the Communications Act of 1934 created the Federal Communications Commission explicitly, not just to protect consumers, but to protect social order. That is one of its jobs. Then, you jump ahead, you've got television, right? And FCC Chair Newton Minow in the 1960s he gave this famous speech about TV creating a vast wasteland. He was openly condemning television for not financial fraud or, physical danger, but because it was damaging culture, right? And the mind and democracy. The government really feared that television would turn us into spectators rather than citizens, would dumb us down in this fundamental way. And, scoff at that if you want to, but how do we feel about television and its effect on the brain, right? Then 1960s, 1970s, people start to recognize, there's some harm here in advertising to children, the hyper-commercialization of childhood, right? The hijacking of their attention over Saturday morning cartoons. And so suddenly there were Federal Trade Commission hearings on unfairness to children. There were first rules about advertising abuses and what, rules there should be around marketing to children. And that's really the first time that policymakers started to treat, attention itself as a regulated resource. We saw this with, repeated in the worries about video games and the creation of the ESRB rating system so that parents could have some sense of what it was they were buying for their kids. Then you had, the COPPA and CDA era in the 1990s and early 2000s where children really were being actively trying to be, the Communications Decency Act, which was later partially struck down, and the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act were really trying to help out with this totally new internet landscape and what effect it might have on kids, because the White House openly framed new media as a potential threat to childhood, not just a commerce, And now, of course, we're emerging from the social media era. I don't know if emerging is the right word, but we are, in that world. And so we've seen Senate hearings on Facebook's effect on kids. There are state-level social media laws. There's no federal laws about it still. But in other countries, that's not the case, right? Australia has just banned social media for kids under the age of 16. China regulates the bejesus out of social media. And this is the closest modern analog to Bernie Sanders, talking here about AI threatening the social fabric. And today, we're really starting to see politicians understand that this isn't just a question of, whether this thing is going to create jobs or take away jobs, that it's truly rewriting norms. It's going to rewrite the way we make relationships. It's going to make it, Bernie Sanders openly talks about what happens, how will a kid connect to romantic partners in the future if he spends his entire time, only connected romantically to a chatbot. And, this is the kind of thing that some of the most cutting edge thinkers on this stuff are really worried about. And so this idea that this technology might be a soft skill eroder, a truth shredder, a relationship changer, right? That is the worry here. And so there's something about, I know, the moral panic that we all kind of roll our eyes at. But there's a long history in this country of thinking about that stuff and trying to grapple with it in some way. Right now, we're in a place where technology companies are ascendant, and they are even getting pushback, getting to push back on the regulations that places like the EU have tried to put into place. But I really think that what we're seeing here is a realization as there's a Duke University law professor named Nita Farahani, who's been a guest on my podcast, and she talks about cognitive liberty. and the idea that we should be free of manipulation in making our decisions, and the recognition that companies are really trying to get into that business. You know, if you think about like the difference between like a farmer's life in the 1700s and the 1400s, if you introduce two farmers from those two eras to one another, they would recognize each other's work. They would say, oh, I know exactly what this is. But a farmer from the 1700s who was introduced to a farmer from the 2000s, his head would pop off, right? The pace and intensity of change is accelerating. And so as we think about how this stuff is going to change our brains, I think we're starting to see it happen fast enough that we might actually see some regulation around it. I think that's worth watching out for as we go forward. Thanks for watching.
The Rip Current is produced and created by me, Jacob Ward. And if you liked this show and you want more content like this, go to theripcurrent.com, where I publish a weekly newsletter that covers these same sorts of stories of the big invisible forces that have us all in their grip. And if you want to really do me a favor, if you could go to where you have listened to this or watched it and like it, share it, or even better, review it. Holy cow, is that helpful? It's the best possible way for me to find a new audience. I really appreciate you being here. Thanks for listening.